Alan.
Yeah? Do you have a list of where everybody's... No, you have to go to the site.
They are still in Wittenberg. This leadership. They are not listed here. I don't think they are because they are still in a meeting in Wittenberg. They should be here. No, not here, sorry. Yes. Christian Walker, they are not mentioned. But they still are in a meeting.
Who?
The Lutherans are still meeting in Wittenberg.
Oh,
Their own council.
okay. Dear friends, could you take your seat? Where is the manager floor? This man? Yes, yes. Ah, there it is. He has to present. No. The man who has to present the card. Dear friends, welcome to the second session before the lunch break, and we'll be in the midday of the first day of our meeting. Before we begin, following our agenda, we would like to welcome two predominant ecumenists and beloved brothers. I'll take chronologically, and then you will see why. On the midst of us, there is Professor Peter Bergen. If he's here, could you stand, please? He's not here? He was in the coffee break. Oh, Olaf is not here?
Peter Borgen.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He must be he was sitting in the corner. Maybe he went outside. You want me to run get him? I'll run get him and you can introduce him.
Okay, he will come. Let's continue with the second brother and old colleague, the Bishop Emeritus Gunnar Stalseth, former Bishop of Oslo. Please, it's here. He was General Secretary, former General Secretary of the Lutheran World Federation, but also
Borgen. He just came back in.
yes, okay, and served also as a Central Committee member of the WCC. Mr. Gunnar, you're welcome, and also you remember you always in our memories. Now the second person who is already entered, yes, Professor Peter Bergen, from United Methodist Church, but living here in Norway. he was the youth delegate in Amsterdam
Yes.
in the first assembly in 1948. And we can recognize also in the screen that there was this certificate in that time. Well, welcome, Professor Bergen. I think you came to serve again with the stewards, huh? He didn't listen. Professor Bergen, I think you came here to serve again with the stewards, huh? To this Central Committee. Eh? You agree on that? Oh. This was always the problem with the stewards. They don't listen well. In order not to do the work sometimes, you know, they provide that I have a problem here and so on. You're welcome. This is the history, yeah? 1948. Now we come back to our work. What? Yes. Also, yes. There's also in midst of us there is general secretaries of areas. From various areas, regional ecumenical organizations around the world. Could you just stand to... Nobody's here? They are out? The areas, general secretaries sometimes are not so much disciplined, you know. And also the general secretary from the Christian Global Forum also is out. They have the same problem with stewards. They are not so obedient sometimes, disciplined, general secretaries. You're welcome. Now we will pass to our work. We have to listen the address of our sister, Dr. Agnes Abuom, the moderator of Central Committee. Please prepare, I think you have copies of her address. It's the Gen 01. And those that don't have, please show your cards and the stewards, they can provide to you copies. Okay, that Metropolitan Bishoy does not have a copy, please. Just a little wait, that all. Okay.
Thank you, Moderator. Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, Designing the Landscape Together. I greet you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Let us thank God for this opportunity to meet again as the Central Committee after 2 years. And let me also express my gratitude to you all for prayers and fellowship after the demise of my husband. Our meeting this time is in this historic city of Trondheim, known as the cradle of Catholic, Lutheran, and Jewish faith traditions, and also for its history, culture, technology, and universities. And may I add, indigenous peoples' cultures as well. We also meet at a moment in time when churches in many parts of the world, especially in Scandinavia and Europe, are preparing themselves to commemorate 500 years anniversary of Martin Luther's Reformation, a significant place and moment indeed to be enriched as we move along in our pilgrimage. I would like to thank the leaders of the Church of Norway and of Trondheim, in particular, for receiving us so warmly and for their generous hospitality. We pray that our deliberations here would inspire, equip, and accompany the various constituents of the World Council of Churches, which we represent here, to join in the pilgrimage of justice and peace, and in the process discover afresh our ecumenical vocation in the world today. Koinonia as partnership for justice and peace. While those at the constituting assembly of the WCC in Amsterdam in 1948 said that they commit themselves to stay together, at the 10th assembly in Busan in 2013, we told each other that we would move together as a movement of churches, living out our hope of God's reign along the way, together and each in our own context. Let us hope that during this pilgrimage, our fellowship will find its ultimate purpose through greater expressions of partnership for God's justice, thereby bringing together unity and justice, which at times were pursued separately during these past years. I also see this as a moment of celebration in anticipation that our long-cherished goal of the unity of the Church for the unity of humankind would soon be a reality in the many and varied expressions of churches working for the realization of the vision of God's reign in our lives and those of generations to come. One particular point of engagement that we have identified for the work of this session of the Central Committee is discerning the landscape together. Discernment is about seeking a holistic understanding of a given reality and clarity of purpose in order that we make right decisions accordingly. Let me therefore emphasize that this exercise of discernment is to be proactive in that we do not settle for what is viable and convenient for each other, for each of us within our resources, vantage points, institutional considerations, and capacities, but instead overcome or enhance the same in response to what God is calling us to do as God's witnesses in the world today. God's justice as our vantage point to discern the landscape. The first step, therefore, is to ask, how do we look at the landscape? Through what kind and whose perspective or lenses do we discern? We are aware that we attempt to do so as churches, as institutions, and organizations in different contexts with distinct theological orientations, geopolitical considerations, and cultural preferences. Besides this, we also recognize that much of our patterns of responses have been shaped and continue to be influenced by the legacy of the past, the predominantly Western confessional, theological, and philosophical tools of analysis and interpretation. While I affirm the strong theological foundation that this provided to the ecumenical movement of the 20th century, I would underline that these were shaped from the vantage points of power and privilege in certain predominantly Christian geopolitical contexts. I say this because the reality today is that we live in a much changed, a rapidly changing, and increasingly pluralistic world, and so are realities of Christian presence and witness. Furthermore, just as much as there are manifold challenges to justice and peace, there are also hundreds and thousands of communities, movements, and initiatives striving for the same. In addition, there are also a number of organizations, including academics, intellectuals, imagining and pursuing justice and peace, each from their own perspective, with their own tools of interrogation and interpretation. There are those who concentrate their efforts exclusively on certain aspects of justice, such as economic justice, ecological justice, rights and opportunities. And there are also those who, while advocating for one expression of justice, ignore other aspirations of justice. For example, I have seen some advocates of economic justice deliberately choosing to ignore the intersections of racism and other forms of discrimination that make injustice more intense in the experience of certain socially disempowered communities. I've also met some gender justice activists who keep the agenda of racial justice out of their purview. There are also those who shout for peace only when their own safety is threatened and while advocating for peace, deliberately ignore the violence inherent in our social and economic structures. We all can cite a number of such instances of pursuits of incomplete concepts of justice and peace. In such a situation, many on the way what is the distinct resource that we carry with us to share with others? And what is our unique perspective or vantage point as a global community of churches with diverse identities and in many geopolitical contexts to pursue justice and peace? And more importantly, what is common about our visions of justice and peace? As a people of the way, on the way, we churches and church institutions have a great responsibility. I'd like to emphasize that the justice we seek is God's justice, which is different from the many ways it is understood and pursued. God's justice is holistic and is radically different from certain pursuits that ignore the inherent and imposed inequalities and consequent dynamics of power in human societies and relationships. As such, it is biased justice, biased towards the victims, the sinned against, the disempowered and the marginalized, the discriminated and the despised, the abused and the violated, the imprisoned and tortured, the displaced and impoverished. It holds that as long as some are treated unjustly and denied life, justice is never real and complete, while it heals and restores the dignity of the victim, it also transforms the aggressor. The reluctance and inability to be just is as dehumanized a condition as being a victim of injustice. God's justice seeks to transform all structures of human relationships and negotiations by upholding the dignity and sanctity of all that God created and continues to create in wisdom and love and in the interconnectedness of life. It is this dispensation of justice that heralds God's peace, a polity of peace that is different from what the world offers, one that is real and lasting and for all. As such, this vocation of peace with justice is not a mere social engagement, but a deeply rooted spiritual one that witnesses to the victory of God's justice in the crucified and risen Lord. It is from this vantage point of God's justice that I ask us to discern the landscape with a view to identifying the signposts of what God wants us to do. Based on this premise of the vantage point of the marginalized and those in the struggles for justice, dignity, and freedom, I'd like to propose a few moral and spiritual challenges for our reflection. The reality of challenges and possibilities. First is the reality of the embrace of the market economy and its concomitant culture and values by all nations, communities, families, and people. The creation and accumulation of wealth are pursued as normative, since wealth is seen as the ultimate solution for all problems. Greed is unshackled and justice is institutionalized. With increased accents on economic growth and individual self-fulfillment, those few with access to wealth and opportunities, while satiating their greed, circulate their own visions of development, exploit and destroy the earth, and dehumanize many, the majority of whom are those made vulnerable by social, economic, and political structures. I offer a picture here that was on the New York Times in April that has seen the great Victoria Falls decline for us to remember. The consequences of this idolatry of mammon are too evident, and as disasters, natural and human-made, strike devastating and displacing millions of lives and communities. We are not oblivious to recent horrendous events such as tornadoes, hurricanes, fires. I don't need to mention all of them, but we are all aware of this. But those in the know and are major contributors of climate injustice resist hearkening to the cry and voice of reason for change, insisting on continuing negotiations in boardrooms over percentages of carbon emissions. In spite of the Millennium Development Goals, which aimed at reducing extreme poverty and hunger by 2015, nothing much has changed, with a small percentage of people owning large portions of wealth and with millions being pushed into more intense forms of poverty and misery. Furthermore, with supranational institutions setting the rules, dissent is ruthlessly suppressed and human rights defenders are tortured, killed, and forced to disappear in many contexts of the world. Let us hope that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, whose motto is that no one will be left out, will make a difference to the 800 million people who still live in extreme poverty, and to the 90 million children under the age of 5, and the 790 million adults who are malnourished, according to the MDG report of 2015. However, these 17 goals to transform our world are silent on checking greed and social injustice, which I believe is necessary for any vision of development to be complete. Second is the global phenomenon of the fear of the other. We live in a pluralistic world, increasingly so with phenomenal, multi-directional movement of people on a daily basis in search of livelihood and of freedom from poverty, violence, and war. With increased preoccupation with wealth and resources, further accelerated by the ideology of the market economy, negotiations among communities have turned conflictual, resulting in hostile attitudes towards the other. Viewing the other as a predator, as an enemy, rather than as a fellow human being in need of space and opportunity to survive. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be a place that is free of xenophobia and the consequential violation of, and violence against minorities, migrants, and refugees, many of whom are actually victims of war and poverty caused by global economic and military powers and political systems. These attitudes of fear and hatred of the other are stabilizing themselves as ideologies that privilege the majority, whether religious, ethnic, or linguistic. What is ironic is that the powerful nations and former colonial powers see more in this grip of fear. The fear of the powerful is as dangerous as their greed. The images of rejection and mistreatment of millions fleeing from war and violence in recent times are still fresh in our minds. Let us remind ourselves that our faith teaches us to be hospitable and to welcome the stranger, for in so doing, we do it unto our Lord Jesus Christ himself. I would like, in this regard, to commend the churches in Europe for their sensitive and generous response and for their great witness, even if it meant facing the ire of their governments and the majority. Third are the unsettling tides of secularization on the one hand and the rise of militant religious fanaticism on the other. Both make life miserable for the vulnerable people and the marginalized sectors. While secularization has been helpful in getting out of the hold of redundant and life-stifling obscuranties to religious practice for many, it has also, however, created possibilities to nurture attitudes that disregard the sanctity of life and thus perhaps inadvertently lend its hand to the ongoing commodification of human life and relationships. Religious fundamentalism, on the other hand, is using religious identities and visions to terrorize, dominate, control, and destroy those who do not subject themselves to the power aspirations of its protagonists or subscribe to their visions of the world. Oppressive cultures and practices are brought back to life and reintroduced as icons of nationalism and patriotism. In many contexts, non-state actors are aggressively controlling public behavior and social relationships with a view to ensuring their continued hegemony. Fourth is the pervasive logic of violence and war as the only viable way to settle disputes, differences, and conflicts between and within nations, among communities and people. The realities of violence in many forms and expressions by all human collectives, terrorism and state terrorism, and the shameful reality of some nations manufacturing and selling weapons of mass destruction to boost their economies points towards yet another sign of moral decadence of our times. For example, roughly 75% of the US military aid in the past 3 years went to Israel and Egypt alone. According to the US government foreign assistance report, the US arms manufacturers earned over $10 billion in revenue from arms trade alone. There are also others, like the United Kingdom, Russia, Israel, China, and even smaller nations like mine getting into production of arms. Yet, also in the forefront of peace negotiations. So we produce arms, but we also are in the forefront of negotiating peace. It should not escape our minds that women and girls remain pawns of any conflict as they bear most of the brunt of violence and war. Fifth is the unbridled technological development. Technology has colonized all aspects of our life, offering solutions for everything, needs and necessities, as well as our desires and fantasies. Even as technology presents opportunities for improved living conditions and reduced human suffering, it also leaves us with questions and challenges about its potentialities in an unequal world. In a world that seems to be driven by the logic of survival of the fittest, we must be aware of the way unbridled technology has caused and continues to cause harm to the Earth's ecosystem and to many around the world. In other words, what does technological advancement mean to those who are disempowered, marginalized, and decimated with the same sophisticated technological development? That is a question that exposes yet another serious moral dilemma for our movement. Last, and with the largest impact of all these features, are the large-scale marginalization, exclusion, dehumanization of millions of people around the world. These are those who have for centuries been disempowered, discriminated against, and kept impoverished by structurally and culturally embedded forms of injustice. Their faces and names are many. The once colonized who continue to be colonized, indigenous people, people of African descent, stateless people, ethnic and religious minorities, Dalits, people with disabilities, women, children, and many others. Unfortunately, some of these communities experience discrimination and exclusion in many of our churches. On a recent visit to the US, as part of the WCC Racial Justice Solidarity visit, I was shocked to find how racism is still rampant in many aspects of life and how some churches are still divided along those lines. It was brought to our attention as the Solidarity team that mass incarcerations in the US targets mainly young men of African descent, and their imprisonment is to feed the greed of mammon. In this case, privately leased prisons that must be filled with prisoners in order for the owners to be paid for their use. The young men are also victims of police violence and killings. Racial injustice is not only a reality and fact in the US. Racism is also rearing its ugly head in other parts of the world. And while we have to reiterate our position as World Council of Churches that racism is a sin, we must act now. Let me commend the Black Lives Matter movement of young people who have taken it upon themselves to remind us of the sanctity of life and that such killings and mass incarcerations must stop. Likewise, I commend the churches and church leaders in the United States who have been on the forefront marching to protest against this heinous act, including mass deportations of individuals that leave families separated. Every life, black, brown, white, red, name it, is as valuable as any other. And every human being is created in the image of God. All lives matter. The issues of racism have not been on the WCC agenda for a while. And I suggest that the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA and the World Council of Churches organize appropriate consultations and activities to address this wounded history and agree on how to press on to combat racism. As an African, I am also aware that we need to continue and even find appropriate entry points with our brothers and sisters of African descent to discern how we move together in the future after the history of slavery and the African Union's vision of the Africa we want. Furthermore, trafficking of people for cheap and forced labor, organ harvesting, and sex industry have become commonplace all over the world. According to Global Slavery Index of this year, about 45 million men, women, and children are trapped in modern slavery, with bonded labor, begging, prostitution as the major forms. What then do we say about this generation? Our generation that boasts of many achievements of human intellect, thriving by subjugating and exploiting millions of vulnerable people. Indeed, a serious moral challenge, a fact that should make us hang our heads in shame. These and similar trends reveal that we belong to a generation that seems to thrive on and boast about its advancement by abusing and exploiting the more vulnerable human beings and the earth. What is disheartening is the total absence of any moral force that holds these powers accountable and a counter-ideology or alternate cause that provokes our conscience to be nurturers rather than destroyers of life. Unfortunately, most faith communities, including Christian, seem either too preoccupied with furthering their own interests of safety and growth and power and prominence, or too enthusiastic for getting co-opted by these powers, which operate through governments, international financial institutions, or corporate houses to endorse their visions of the world. This is perhaps a red flag that we need to be aware of in our pilgrimage. Instead, how can we be catalysts of a moral force? How can we activate a moral authority of the church, faith community, and an alternate vision in partnership with other faith communities and social movements who are likewise restless about the moral decadence of our world? How can we enhance the efforts of and work with those who believe and are committed to the values of God's kingdom, even if they do not say so, rather than remain silent and inert toward those who are actively working against it and furthering their own empires? Challenges as opportunities. Thinking further, let me reiterate that pilgrimage is a journey that involves introspection, openness to learning through new encounters, changing and effecting change, shedding cumbersome weights and accruing helpful resources, and reaching the goal together. I'd like to highlight a few possibilities that I believe will help our reflection to result in some decisive shifts. First of all, pilgrimage requires an attitude of humility and repentance. We certainly have wrestled with some of these challenges in the past and have undoubtedly made some gains, and we thank God for this. Yet, we need to constantly introspect on how much our reflective processes and consequent affirmations result in concrete action in making a difference on the ground in the lives of the people on whose behalf we speak. Analysis, interpretation, and statements seem to exhaust all that we do for justice and peace in our ecumenical gatherings. Where and what difference have this made? And what difference have we made as participants of these organizations? These are questions that we need to ask ourselves. It is perhaps time that we moved from rhetoric as executive committee members, as central committee members, as commissions, as Christians, to engage fully in these issues of pilgrimage. The complex challenges we face today and the witness of many already in the forefront of struggles demand that we move away from the culture of conferences and statements to begin to get engaged in actions that nurture hope and alternatives. What story do we have to share along the journey? Stories of people in the struggle against injustice and hope. I would encourage us all, in fact, each one of us, to come to the next meeting of our Central Committee with a story of your personal participation in the pilgrimage of justice and peace. Let us share and be enriched by these experiences of hope and be inspired to do more as we move along. Second, it is one thing to speak about injustice out there in the public square, but it is a completely different thing to deal with it right within our household. Abuse of power, deliberate silence and indifference on issues of justice, excessive preoccupation with ecclesiastical issues, discrimination and restriction of all God's people at our tables of celebration and discernment and deliberation, and the continued monopolization of institutional space by some for such long stretches that leaves hardly any space for the younger generations, do not make our assertions and affirmations about justice any more credible than empty rhetoric. While churches cannot be exempt from social influences, we need, however, to uphold the integrity of our moral choices in the way we organize and manage our institutional expressions. To that extent, we must ensure that the World Council of Churches not only remains a role model, but also a trend setter in healthy processes of transparency and accountability and of inclusion and participation by all who belong to the church. Third, since the denial of justice and absence of peace are primarily expressions of responsible assertions of power and dominance, we must, in the example of our Lord Jesus Christ, actively be engaged in renouncing values and attitudes that glorify power and all vestiges that keep us trapped in fear of poverty, and denounce systems and cultures that diminish and deny life. In the same vein, we are called to hold the international financial institutions, military powers, economic policies, industry, and political systems accountable rather than simply opting to be their endorsing agents. We need to address the root causes of migration and unemployment, and expose and confront warmongering and weapons industries and those models of development that ruthlessly plunder the earth and displace people. To that extent, pilgrimage is opting for costly discipleship. Fourthly, pilgrimage is about hope, breaking into our present, motivating us to move forward, overcoming hurdles, exploring and inventing creative possibilities along the way. It is a time to encounter God's liberating and transforming grace present and active in unexpected places and people, and to announce hope through a creative engagement with the world. Hope in God, in Jesus Christ, compels us to discover something new and attempt something different. We therefore need to move from the nostalgia of the past, set aside our burdensome preoccupations and instruments that have outlived their purpose, and venture into new and relevant areas of engagement. At one point in time, the member churches and organizations needed instruments like WCC, REOs, and CCs to bring them together and to learn to work together. Now our member churches are far ahead with their own creative ecumenical engagements in their specific context. We must perhaps refrain from functioning in the same mold and with the same methodology of programmatic work in certain areas that we have done for decades. We need to reset our priorities and methodologies as part of our work to accompany the member churches in the pilgrimage. Ecumenical instruments as catalysts. Against this background, we also need to reflect on the role of the ecumenical instruments, such as the World Council of Churches. What does it take to enable them to become more active and sustained in their ministry of accompanying churches and in promoting ecumenical action for justice and peace? The vocation of justice and peace is not confined to specialized ministries, but an essential mark of Christian discipleship and hence deeply spiritual, both at personal and larger levels. However, sadly, many Christians keep these outside the ambit of religious practice. We have also relegated the essential responsibilities of mission, diaconia, and public engagement to mission boards and specialized ministries. Some of us have taken up the responsibility of doing this on behalf of the churches rather than enabling the churches to actively engage themselves. The challenge before us is, how do we encourage, enable, and assist our churches to live out their love of God in Jesus Christ and of the neighbor by resisting injustice and untruth? It is not important what we, as the World Council of Churches, the Central Committee, and the staff in Geneva do and say on behalf of the churches, but what our churches in each specific context are able to do because of us. That is what we must aim for. We must also make the pilgrimage more invitational and inspiring for young people and women. First, let me talk about young women, young people. Youth are in the forefront of many creative endeavors today all over the world, leading movements and organizations. Governments, political parties, corporate houses, and even reactionary forces are recruiting and relying on youth power and imagination. I do not commend that we too must abuse or indoctrinate our young people like the way these do. But we must remember that it was the students, it was the youth movements that were at the heart of the formation of our movement. The missionary movement that began in 1910 too was a young people's movement. They are the lifeline, the root of the ecumenical movement and the church. Unfortunately, they do not seem to find our ecumenical institutions and churches sensitive to their questions, aspirations, imaginations, or capable of inspiring their creative energy. Perhaps our spaces are too overwhelmed with issues of institutional management, ecclesiastical traditions, and protocols. We have often said that the World Council of Churches and our churches will be open to young people, but have done very little to create sufficient spaces for them. Likewise, we must realize that women are in the forefront of many progressive movements for justice, peace, and freedom in many parts of the world. We have not only been inconsistent in our solidarity with women in their struggles for dignity, equity, justice, and participation, but also failed to recognize their capacities to persist in the struggles for justice and peace. I commend the Pan-African Women of Faith, which recently met and was looking at the leadership question for overcoming and ending hunger and poverty. They advocate for the spiritually, socially, materially marginalized and seek to influence leaders at national, regional, and international levels so as to promulgate and implement policies that are pro-poor and strengthen commitments to women's leadership. We must realize that our young people and women have the creative capacities and moral stamina to lead us forward in new pathways. Pilgrimage offers an excellent opportunity to rely on these resources, not only in our search for justice and peace, but also for more creative and credible expressions of ecumenism that are more organic than cerebral and more people-based than institutional. And we've seen it through the presence of our stewards. Justice and peace are not the sole concerns of Christians and churches. Let me reiterate that there are many others along the way, in fact, ahead of us. Should we not partner with them, or at least strengthen partnership with them? There was a moment in the life of the Council that was rich with the fresh insights and challenges that social movements brought, and that enriched the meaning and purpose of our movement. Moderator, as I conclude, we affirm that the Church is a community of believers and a communion of all God's people involved in the mission of heralding God's reign. There are so many, some right within our churches, who are actively engaged in the struggles for justice and peace in many places. I hope that this pilgrimage will help us open the space for them and reclaim this partnership. Partnership for justice and peace as partnership with God. In closing, let me reiterate that the pilgrimage offers us immense possibilities to reimagine ourselves as a movement of God's people in the mission, open and inclusive, and agile and receptive to the promptings of the Spirit. We have affirmed time and again that the Church is a people's movement, and that the pilgrimage of justice and peace will also engage people of other faiths and men and women of goodwill. Let us reclaim and rebuild our capacity for discourse. There is room in the gospel for disagreement, but there is no room for disengagement. As we walk together, we should be mindful that even under normal processes of walks or journeys, people will stop, greet, join the walk for a while, and some may branch off as you continue toward the destination. Let us walk together with those who are denied justice, with people of all living faiths, movements, and all others who are striving for justice and peace, kindling hope through creative alternatives, speaking truth to powers, and holding them accountable, so that in this partnership for justice and peace, we may find ourselves working with God, with our God of life. God of life, lead us to justice and peace. Amen.
We thank Madam Moderator for her excellent address, its consistency and richness of thoughts and reflections that you have shared with us. We have now time for any kind of questions that you have to raise to her. I would like just to remind you that was forgotten, apologize, that this session at the beginning still is a hearing session. and then we move to an action. We have also not only the address to complete, but also we have the public issues. Then we divide the rest of the time until the lunch break for questions and response from Madam the Moderator, and also then to move to the public issues. We have 4 microphones, more or less 2 are here, 1 there, and the other on the middle. Please, those that want to raise questions, move to the microphones, identify yourself, who you are, name, and your church. And please try to be brief in order to have more participation. Microphone 2, Dr. Sharon.
Thank you, Moderator. I am Sharon Watkins, Disciples of Christ, United States. I also serve as the chair of the board of the National Council of Churches of the United States, and it's really in that role that I rise to speak. I wish to express great appreciation to our moderator and leadership for these remarks, and especially would like to say a word of appreciation on behalf of United States churches and the National Council of Churches for the solidarity visit to the United States on racism. You have seen now our struggle, and you have spoken to it well, and we are grateful for the solidarity and partnership. I'd say on behalf of the United States, of the National Council of Churches of the United States, that we were honored to partner with the World Council of Churches leadership in the preparation of the visit and to be able to participate through many of our leaders and persons, 2 of our executive committee, in addition to myself, Bishop Marianne, and Reverend Karen Georgia Thompson, the secretary of our executive committee, were able to arrange their schedules to be along the way for part of that. And we look forward to continuing the partnership in addressing together these issues. Dr. Jim Winkler, our General Secretary, has assured us that that partnership must continue. Also want to say that with you, that the issue of racism, which we experience with such devastation in the United States, we understand to be an issue worldwide. It is an issue that must be addressed theologically as well as in terms of justice. And I welcome the initiative that the World Council of Churches would resume its important historical role in helping the world to understand the devastation of racism, and hope that we will, through our programmatic work as a council, work to fulfill our potential in addressing this issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Watkins. Microphone 4. Ms. Ariet, please.
Henrietta Huta Barat Lebang from Indonesia, Toraja Church, Indonesia, and I will speak on point 24. But before that, I would like to appreciate the presentation of our moderator, which gave us some insights and food of thought with regard to the theme of this Central Committee. I would specifically address the point 24, which is challenging matters coming from the Communion of Churches in Indonesia as a president of the Communion of Churches in Indonesia, and it gives me some food of thought. How do we move together to be an inclusive ecumenical community? And also with my previous experience with the Christian Conference of Asia. Here it says about the role of the REOs and the NCCs. I think to me, there is always a need to assess the landscape in a specific area, such as region, such as country. We have a common challenge globally, but at the same time, we have the challenge which is more specific to country or to region. And in that regard, I think it's very important to us, as you mentioned, to develop in the pilgrimage for justice and peace also the spirit of partnership. how do we assess together the landscape in the area? And I think in this regard, how do we develop a common framework and how do we share information? I think this is one of the crucial things, so that we can work together in action and avoiding more in complementary rather than sometimes also in competition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Microphone 3, please.
Sofia Kamnarin, Uniting Church in Sweden member. Thank you, moderator, for reminding us of shared responsibility, the need of conversion for all of us, mostly for us up in the northwest. Thank you for your strong message on justice versus militarism, racism, sexism, economism, and for mentioning these also as root causes of climate change and migrant crisis. Thank you for giving us a challenging, holistic message on God's justice and a theological understanding, for uplifting the sanctity of all life. We are called to repentance, as you say, and a renewed devotion on our common pilgrimage of justice and peace, together with all people in the cross and resurrection of Christ. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kang, microphone 2, please.
Thomas Kang, Evangelical Church of the Lutheran Confession Brazil, member. I'd like to also to express my deep appreciation for the moderator's address. It's a very multi-dimensional approach that you're using, a very holistic one. And I would like to just to emphasize or actually make a comment on 2 points. One is the paragraph 15 on the racism, has already been addressed by Dr. Watkins as well. The question of the racism in the United States is a very important one. We all know that. But I like also, since this is a very global issue, to also acknowledge, at least emphasize the point that in Brazil, racism is not as well known maybe as in other countries, such as the countries that had a historically institutionalized racism, such as United States and South Africa. But we have violations of rights of black people and mulatto people every day in Brazil, since there are lots of drug trafficking, and police goes to the slums and starts to invade people's houses, people's homes, and nobody knows about it because of the lack of political voice of these marginalized populations. So I think it's important for the church to acknowledge this. And my second point is your comment about the young people's space in the church. You might think sometimes that the young people are always like pushing the same agenda as an end in itself, but I think that's not the case. And I think give you an example of the point here now. We've seen the stewards were now presented, and I'm very happy to see those stewards working again. I've been the steward myself in 2006, and this is how I began my walk in the ecumenical movement. And there are lots of colleagues, stewards colleagues here in this meeting as well. But I'd like to express my sadness for the fact that the stewards are all from this region. I mean, of course, I want the 15 stewards from this region here. But I know we are in problems with our financial conditions. But that's a very sensitive point, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to remind you, the bell that we're here is just to remind us the time, that 3 minutes, and to respect a little in order to have more participation. Microphone 3, Mrs. Simonian.
Madam Moderator, your report heartened me because it took me back to the time when I started as a youth in the ecumenical movement, and it was this kind of language and commitment that we were invited to participate in. And this started in the Middle East, and then in the wider ecumenical movement. Now, in this whole presentation, I think the most important thing is the empowerment of the churches locally. How can the ecumenical movement, the World Council of Churches in this particular case, really empower our local churches to become the advocates in their own regions? And then how these different experiences of our local churches could come here and really become the voice to the world. Because the world today, as you said, needs an alternative rhetoric and an alternative voice. Therefore, my plea would be that the program committee looks into the programs not as something coming from up to the bottom, but really to assess and see how each of these programs that are being proposed could be coming from bottom to up, to make this coherent voice represent the new pluralism of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Metropolitan?
Metropolitan Justice Abuom from the Syrian Orthodox Church of Antioch. Thank you, Dr. Moderator, for this rich speech that you touched many issues on justice and peace. This morning, I heard our friend Tara was speaking about that relationship is in her local ethnic nation is like when you come face to face. And for me now, solidarity actually is like when you put hands with hands. And my concern here that we as a church, as a Christians, we have to look also to some other groups in the world that are having the same suffering that we have. Now, how can we put hands with other hands, whether they are non-Christians, seculars, religious, any kind of groups, so that we strengthen our message to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Metropolitan. Just to remind, there are three, and please, we have to close here and not to give time to moderator to respond, and then to proceed to the second matter that we have with public issues. Professor Fernando.
Thank you, Moderator. Thank you, Sister Agnes, for this wonderful analysis, and thank you for your leadership, also during your hardship within your family. There's one a small comment on paragraph number 1 that I just cannot resist to say something about this when you speak about the churches in Europe getting ready to commemorate the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's Reformation. There are more churches of the Reformation than just the Lutherans, I might want to remind you, and in our understanding, at least in my tradition, the Reformation was not owned just by Martin Luther, but that is just a side remark. We can discuss that at a later stage, I guess. Then, more seriously on paragraph number 12, when you speak about the pervasive logic of violence and war, and you have a list there of countries who export and manufacture weapons, small arms, but also weapons of mass destruction, with shame, I want to say that Germany should be on this list. Germany, my country, is really at the forefront, the third largest exporter of weapons. And we, the churches in Germany, together are really working on this issue as much as we can, getting all together in order to fight this misery. One last comment on your paragraph number 15, when you talk about racism as one of the issues that are still dividing the churches. After the shootings in Orlando, I wonder what we are saying about that incident and what we are saying as churches, maybe as the World Council of Churches, about those killings against LGBT. I'm missing that issue in this analysis, And I think it should be here somewhere when we talk about the biased justice of God. Thank you.
Thank you. Microphone 2.
Thank you, Moderator. Rex Reyes from the Episcopal Church in the Philippines. Thank you, Madam Agnes, for a very refreshing address. There's one single reference to indigenous peoples on number 14. This is just to inform one and all that for the last 3 days, indigenous peoples were also met here in Trondheim, and that at some subsequent session of this assembly, 2 resolutions from the indigenous peoples will be set forth. Please pay attention to those resolutions. Thank you, Moderator.
Thank you very much. Number 3.
Thank you, Moderator Silisha, United Church of Zambia. I rise to, first of all, second, Moderator, the issue of crossbreeding the stewards. I second that, and heavily and seriously and passionately, even in a small way. But I rose to, just as I say, thank you so much to the inviting and so heart-touching presentation, Moderator, to speak to one comment on the commodification of human life, but also the trafficking of young people, especially from Africa. A life story, Moderator, in 2 sentences. November last year in Zambia, I was southern part of my country at the border with Namibia. And there I encountered 7 intercepted young people, ranging from 4 to 7, from Congo DR, passing through Zambia as a corridor of human trafficking. Moderator, beautiful young 4 girls and 3 boys, innocently looking, who had been intercepted from a bus destined to Namibia and could not speak any language but French. I couldn't believe that I was in the face of death. I couldn't believe that. And I call through you, Moderator, on leaders of Africa, African churches, Central Africa in particular. Let us open our eyes. Let us open our ears. There's so much happening in our region, and we may be used as a corridor of destruction, resuscitation of modern slavery. We have the role, and we are the leaders. Let us make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The last one, microphone 2.
Cornelia Füllkrug-Weitzel, EKD member substitute. Thank you, Madam Moderator, for your tough and encouraging speech. Let me just highlight 3 of your points, which I received with great gratefulness. First one is you were brave enough to commend the European churches for their courageous way to respond to the influx of so many refugees in Europe. But I would love to see that it would have been or still would be that courageous. So indeed, there was a huge hospitality by many, or by all the European churches, and I may especially mention the Greek and the Serbian churches who really did their utmost. But at the same time, I believe that we can do much more when it comes to counteract Islamophobia or xenophobia or racism or nationalism, which is on the increase in Europe, partly due to the fact that we receive so many refugees. And the churches need, I think, a lot of theological debate among themselves and a lot more of encouragement to stand up for the right of refugees to live in their midst as long as they need to live there. My second point is you mentioned that we should not get too enthusiastic, that's paragraph 18, for getting co-opted by the powers which operate through governments, international financial systems or corporate houses to endorse their vision of the world. Indeed, I see with the new debate or the new recognition of religion as a potential for development via or through international organizations, international finance organizations and governments, I see a new threat for churches to maybe potentially become co-opted or instrumentalized. Okay. And I think, again, this needs a WCC reflection. Okay. Third point. Okay, I leave the third point. It would take me too long. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Agnes, now a little time to respond.
Thank you, Moderator. Thank you all for your comments. I think I'll not respond to so many because a number are comments and I'd like us to engage in a deliberation. Just to say that responding to the issue of stewards, I think we do need to consider seriously as leadership how we can avail resources to have that cross-breeding. Secondly, the issue of reformation. Professor, I take note of that with humility. I'm an Anglican, you know.
We know that.
The issue of LGBTQ, I think it's just an omission because of segregation. They're also facing violence. So I just want to acknowledge the comments taken and say that we continue the dialogue. Thank you.
Once more, we express our appreciation and thanks to Madam Moderator for the address. Are we ready now to receive the, as a Central Committee, to receive the address? Please show your cards. The document was received. Thank you very much. The document goes to all committees of the Central Committee for reflection and for further reflection and also for decision. Now, we move to the last part of our session, is the presentation of the public issues. This is here the director of CCIA, Peter Brock, and also the moderator of the Public Issue Committee, Bishop Samuel. We speak. Bishop?
Both will speak.
Huh?
We both will speak.
Oh, both, okay. Please prepare the documents Gene Pub 2, 3, and 4. I think we have your files.
Thank you, Moderator. I will just give a very brief introduction before Peter, our director, comes in. In the last Central Committee, there was a consensus amongst us that in future, guideline on important issues be presented to the Central Committee prior to what we receive from members of the Central Committee. Our colleagues and our staff have worked very hard and have highlighted 4 important and prominent issues which you will find in Gen PUB 04, and they have already been circulated, to which Peter will give a brief introduction. Kindly take time to read them and come up with your comments and suggestions. You will also be receiving another document, which is, or you have already received another document, which is Gen PUB 03, informing about actions on public issues reported in the last meeting of the Executive Committee. So that will also be slightly touched upon. I want to make 1 or 2 comments, and details will be shared by Peter. As has been our practice, we will have an opportunity to submit issues from within members, churches present here, and issues which are pertinent, which are important and which have a wider impact. So as you give issues, I'm sure you will bear these factors in mind. And not only will you just give us an issue, but you will give us a brief write-up or a detailed write-up as to what you are trying to say and why should that issue be considered by the Central Committee. It should be very convincing. This will go to the committee tomorrow, and then it will be sorted out as to which particular issue needs to come for approval in the Central Committee. I will now therefore ask Peter to give a brief description on both these documents, and also please inform all of us the deadline or the final timeline of submitting our issues to the Public Issues Committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Samuel. You can speak from here.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. As the moderator of the Public Issues Subcommittee has said, there are 3 documents relevant to this issue of the public issues item before this session of the Central Committee. The document Gen Pub 02 is the currently applicable procedures for public statements and minutes by the Central Committee. Gen Pub 3 is the summary of actions taken on public issues since the last presentation of that summary. And then Gen Pub 04 is a summary, not the full texts, but summaries of the currently prepared proposed statements to be considered for action by this Central Committee. I'll take you first to those proposals. You'll see that the first such proposed action, a statement on religion and violence. I won't read the summary that is presented there, least of all the full text of the current draft statement, but I do commend that issue and the summary presented there to your consideration. I also note that the issue of religion and violence will be the subject of one of the thematic plenary sessions later during the life of this Central Committee, which I think will also inform our deliberations on this very important topic. The second issue summarized here, and for which a draft text has been prepared, is a statement on the Israel and Palestine conflict and peace process. Obviously a very long-standing concern and current concern of the ecumenical movement. Once again, I commend this summary to your consideration. The third prepared text and summary presented here is for a statement on the forced displacement and refugee and migrant crisis, a very persistent theme in many of our deliberations nationally and internationally during these days. The summary is before you, and a text has been prepared according to that summary. And finally, a statement on the shrinking space for civil society. This is a concern that has been worked on by the World Council of Churches, drawing in particular from the extensive work done in the and through the ACT Alliance on this very question. The summary is once again before you, and a detailed text has been prepared. Now, if I may take you back to the document Gen Pub 03, this is the summary of actions on public issues that have been undertaken by or through the instruments of the World Council of Churches in the intervening period since such a summary was last reviewed by the Executive Committee. It is presented for information only for you at this point. I don't think it needs further elaboration from me in this session, but I would like to take you in particular back to the document on procedures for public statements and minutes by the Central Committee, Gen Pub 02. In particular to paragraph 6 of those procedures. As you have heard, we have 4 detailed draft texts that have already been prepared in advance and will be the substance of discussions and considerations by the Public Issues Subcommittee. But there is also provision according to these procedures in the case of emergent circumstances and situations arising immediately before or during meetings of the Central Committee which are considered to warrant a public statement or minute without the normal preparatory research and consultation process, the following procedures shall apply. A deadline for receiving proposals from Central Committee members for any such statements or minutes concerning emergent situations shall be stipulated at an early session of the meeting, giving at least 24 hours notice. Proposals received after this deadline may not be able to be considered by the Public Issues Committee during that meeting, but may be referred to the General Secretary for consideration and any appropriate action. Proposals for any such statements or minutes should be accompanied by relevant background information. And subject to compliance with those requirements, proposals received will, in accordance with its prescribed mandate, be received and analysed by the Public Issues Subcommittee, which will make such recommendations and prepare such text for action by the Central Committee as it considers appropriate. So these are the principles that will apply in terms of any additional issues that are addressed to this Central Committee session. And there is a procedure for doing that. There is an email address to which we will invite any such proposals to be sent with the relevant background substantiation. And I believe my colleagues will be projecting the email address is there, so please take careful note of that. And staff will receive any such proposals at that email address. So we take this occasion now to give due notice, 24 hours notice, for any such submissions, which will therefore expire by lunchtime tomorrow, and invite any submissions for such actions to this email address.
Thank you, Peter. I think it's clear. There is any question? The three documents that were presented by the Public Issues, the two were for information, and the number 4 is for action, just to receive the 4 proposal, for public issue statements. If there is no... Oh, yes, Your Eminence.
Thank you. Can I
please
give a small notice?
Yeah, yes, please.
Of course, you have heard about the trial to kill by terrorist attack our beloved Patriarch of Antioch, Mary Ignatius Avram. I am Metropolitan Bishoy of the Miet Coptic Orthodox Church. Terrorist attack after his consecration of the monument for the Syriac genocide, Sifu, last Sunday, 19th of June. Thank God that he moved 5 minutes before the explosion.
Please continue.
He moved from the outside place where the explosion happened, and his life was saved. But I shall try to pass something about this to the Public Issue Committee, but also I think members from the Syrian Orthodox Church of Antioch will do the same. But it is very important for us that for the first time in the Middle East, at least in this period, in this century, there was a terrorist attack to kill the patriarch of one of our churches, of the Oriental Orthodox family of churches. So it is very important for us that the World Council of Churches should show that this is not acceptable. Also, for every safety of people in the Middle East, we ask for declaration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We keep His Holiness in our prayers. Microphone 2, I think, will be the last one.
Okay, thank you. Andrej Jeftić, Serbian Orthodox Church. In the described procedures for public statements, document Gen Pub 02, the point 3 tells us that the statements shall be circulated to Central Committee members well in advance of the next scheduled meeting, and reactions invited. And I just wanted to ask you, I don't recall getting any of these drafts of these statements which are here proposed. Thank you.
Thank you. Bishop, you want to speak, please? Last.
Thank you, Mark McDonald.
Microphone 1.
Yes. Thank you, Mark McDonald. I just want to remind everyone that the Indigenous Peoples Conference met prior to this. We have a statement prepared that we'll be submitting and is available to anyone who would like to see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for reminding us. You want to respond? Just
yes, thank you.
Peter respond and then.
Thank you. Very briefly, to the first intervention, indeed, we received the news of this attack during the Executive Committee meeting with great alarm and concern. The General Secretary has spoken to the issue in a public remark of his own. And I think this attack is another and very concerning and dramatic illustration of the overall concern that is spoken to in the proposed text on religion and violence. And I think it'll be something that we take very good note of and refer to in the substantiation for that intervention. To the second point, you are quite right, sir, that the proposed or the procedures do stipulate that the text should be supplied well in advance. And indeed, we were not able to meet that standard during this preparation for this meeting. The procedure that did occur was that the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs examined and reflected on the issues that might be presented to the Central Committee for Action during its March session. And a list of issues, I think some 14 issues in total, were raised as possible matters for concern. Due to constraints upon staff, time and capacity, we were very late in delivering detailed statements on even 4 of the number 1 priority issues. Those statements have, however, been the subject of extensive consultation among staff and members of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs. The texts that are currently prepared are each of them approximately 3 pages in length, and due to the time and constraints upon our capacity to prepare them, including translation for the Central Committee, they are not, unfortunately, presently before you in their full text versions. Just these summaries that I have just presented and are reflected in the relevant document, Gen Pub 04. So indeed, you are quite right, and our apologies for our failure to live up to that standard. Now the Public Issues Committee is seized of the matter and will be drawing on reflections for all those who are concerned to intervene and to present perspectives relevant to these issues or others. So I hope that if there are concerns that you would like to raise, perspectives you would like to share in relation to these issues or others, that you will communicate them to us, and we will do our level best to make sure that they are fully reflected in the texts that are presented ultimately to the Central Committee and plenary for action.
Okay, thank you for your clarification. We're ready now to receive the document Gen Pub 04. Please show your cards. Thank you. The text was received and goes to the Public Issue Committee. Any announcement, General Secretary?
Yes, Moderator, we repeat the announcement from the morning session that if you want to change your clothes to be prepared for the procession this afternoon, do so at lunchtime, because we have short of time after the next session and we need to move on our pilgrimage. We will departing from the conference exit from this part of the hotel upstairs from this hall. And you must have your ticket for the reception with you and be ready to present it. If you don't have the ticket yet, please see the registration desk before the procession. And again, the second announcement, a consensus orientation session for committee moderators and rapporteurs will be held tomorrow, on the 23rd, from 1 o'clock to 2:30 in the Target room. And you will be served lunch there as well. These were the announcements.
Thank you, General Secretary. Thanks to all of you that participate and input in this plenary. Before we break for lunch, let's have 1 minute silence and a little prayer before to move to the lunch. O merciful God, God of peace and justice, we thank you that you blessed this ecumenical gathering already this morning at the beginning of our work. And we are very thankful for your mercy and love that we offer